Hello, I've come to another location. I've had to come to Leicester again to the clinic for my ear, so I've come to another 82nd Airborne related location that is literally just around the corner from the clinic that I was at today. So what we're looking at here is a place known as the Shady Lane Arboretum, and Shady Lane Arboretum was the campsite of Colonel Reuben Tucker's 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment from April to September, the first week of September 1944. So the entrance where you can just see that blue car coming now, I'll just zoom in slightly, is the old camp entrance. And there's a small car park there for people who fancy a little walk to park their cars and whatnot. Obviously it looks very different to what it did back in 1944. It was a predominantly tented camp. There was hundreds of US Army pyramid tents on this site that housed the vast majority of the men of the 504th, and the officers were billeted locally with families in Evington and nearby villages. And then after the 504th left, it was turned into a POW camp with Italian, if I remember correctly, POWs on site. I'll try and walk through because I want to try and show you the Evington church, if we can see the spire through the trees. So just to give you some backstory, those who know the division's history quite well, the 504th arrived in England about 2 months after the remainder of the division did, because when the 82nd were withdrawn from combat in at the end of 1943, they were sent to England to prepare for D-Day, and the 504th were held back on request to hold the line, or well, ended up holding the line along the Mussolini Canal at Anzio. When they arrived in the UK, they were in pretty bad shape. They'd suffered a great number of combat casualties at Anzio, and had lost a great deal of their equipment to the poor conditions. Uniform items were destroyed or beyond repair. So when they arrived in the UK, they were actually virtually beyond recognition as an airborne unit. Their M42 jumpsuits were beyond repair. Most of them arrived wearing tankers jackets, M41 jackets, the like. So they were in a bad way. And I think at Ridgeway had kept up on the status of the regiment whilst they were fighting at Anzio. I'll just periodically give you a view across the Arboretum. So obviously all of these trees weren't here in World War II. They were planted afterwards to create the Arboretum. It was just an open field that connected onto an old golf club. So going back, Ridgeway had kept a pretty good idea of the condition of the regiment and pretty much knew the status of their casualties and whatnot, and was, I think, pretty accepting of the fact that they weren't going to be involved on D-Day in the division's involvement in Operation Neptune. So Gavin, on the other hand, I think tried to maintain a well, let's wait and see mentality about it. So when the 504th arrived here in April 1944, as I say, 2 months after the remainder of the division did, well, almost the remainder of the division, I'll go into that. Gavin drove his Jeep from Braunston Park, where the divisional headquarters was, to Thurmby and Scraptoft train station, which is in between here, the Evington, the village where this campsite was mainly located, and Scraptoft, where the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment were located, and so that he could pick up Reuben Tucker himself. And on the journey back in the Jeep, they had a conversation, and it was at that point that Gavin realised that the regiment was not in any fit state to be involved in the campaign in Normandy, which was a huge loss for the division. They were a great regiment, and they were commanded by an excellent regimental CO in Colonel Reuben Tucker, who went on to command the regiment for the remainder of the Second World War, and obviously proved himself a pretty good regimental CO at various points of the Second World War, particularly 76 years ago, recent weeks, 76 years ago, Operation Market Garden, 504th probably performed the best out of all of the regiments in the 82nd, including the infamous Vaal River crossing that was carried out predominantly by the 3rd Battalion. So the reason that I mentioned, of course, that the bulk of the division had come back in in Feb, was because, of course, the 504th Regimental Combat Team was held back in Italy, and so that included the entirety of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, the entirety of the 376th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, who were billeted in Burbage and Hinckley in Leicestershire, and one company of the 307th Airborne Engineer Battalion, who were billeted also in Burbage and Ullersthorpe in Leicestershire. So yeah, this is where the 504th were. Some quick stories about the 504th camp. Oh, actually, just one more thing before I move on. I'll try and zoom in. So you've got the top of the Evington, oh, my finger's in the wrong place, top of the Evington Church Tower, just there. The Evington Church Tower actually contains an American flag, a 48-star American flag that was gifted by the 504th. It also contains, if I remember rightly, a small plaque in their memory, and also on the outside of the church, if you ever get the opportunity to go and see, is reportedly the camp's original flagpole from their drill square. I've never been able to verify whether or not that's true, whether or not it is actually the original flagpole, but it is an old one, it is a wooden one, it could very well be. So the reason I wanted to show you the church was that opposite the church in Evington is a village hall, is Evington's village hall. And when the 504th arrived at Evington, at the request of the army, any villagers that had space in their houses to accommodate officers were asked to attend a meeting at the village hall. And at this village hall meeting, anyone with the ability to house one officer, for example, was asked to raise their hands. Anyone with the ability to house two officers was asked to raise their hands. And anyone with the ability to raise so on and so on and so on, until all the regimental officers were basically billeted locally with families. So it was actually only the NCOs and the enlisted men that were actually on the campsite here at Evington. So yep, I was nearby, so I thought I'd come and show you the Shady Lane Arboretum here in Leicestershire, which is the former campsite of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Actually, one more story before I go, just to bore you all a bit more. One more story about the village hall. When the 504th left Shady Lane for what we now obviously know to be Operation Market Garden, they had a great deal of ration material, for want of better terminology. Huge tins of chopped tomatoes and chopped vegetables, and cooking lard, all sorts of rations, truckloads of the stuff. Logistically speaking, it would have been incredibly difficult for them to get it all over to the Netherlands, post Market Garden, and it wasn't even really that necessary that they did so. They could be resupplied when over there. So they took truckloads of what they had left and dumped anything that was susceptible to being damaged by rain inside the village hall itself, and anything that was in tins or that couldn't be damaged by rain was left outside the village hall, and essentially it was gifted to the village of Evington and any of the surrounding areas, particularly for use for people that really, really needed it. And as I'm sure you can imagine, it was greatly appreciated, and it was incredibly useful to those who had lived under ration conditions for many years by that point. So yeah, this is the Shady Lane Arboretum, home to the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment.